Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. I want to thank Farm Management Canada for the opportunity to speak with you today. I've spent a good portion of my career working on disaster recovery and risk management issues, and I wanted to share some observations I've made regarding how we gamble with the future and what we need to do to improve our odds. We're entering a period of history where not only disaster risks are increasing, but so too are our options for managing them. Yet it could be argued that never have we known so much about risk and done so little about it. Humans have been pretty good about managing certain types of risk when cause and effect are closely linked in time or space. For instance, if you see a predator, you run. We're also not bad at managing risks when there's a regular periodicity associated with a hazard. If a local river, for instance, floods every spring, we grow to expect certain types of impacts and figure out ways to manage or avoid them. However, if one moves cause and effect away from each other in time or space, our perceptions of risk start to fail us. For instance, smokers put a higher value on the immediate perceived benefits, despite the abundance of scientific evidence that smoking has negative long-term health impacts. Equally, if a once-in-a-100-year flood starts to occur more frequently, people are usually poorly prepared to deal with the consequences. The mayor of Princetown was interviewed last week by CBC on the state of his town. He stated that flood levels had reached a 200-year record high, noting that this was a once-in-a-lifetime event. Interestingly, the flood expert interviewed immediately after him stated that this once-in-a-100-year flood event was projected to start happening more frequently, precisely every 30 years. Increasing scientific evidence now shows that we're entering a period of history where our expectations regarding the frequency, intensity, and scale of disasters are being severely challenged. The number of lightning strikes has increased dramatically over the past 10 years, driving up the number and intensity of wildfires. Severe droughts are also increasing, not only in the prairies, but also across other parts of Canada. Once-in-a-100-year events are happening with increasing frequency, yet we continue to use language that inadequately captures the true risk. The phrase once in 100 years was adopted as a way of simplifying the idea that a flood had a 1% chance of happening every year. It does not literally mean that a flood happens once every 100 years. I think it's time we dropped this phrase given the confusion it causes. People think, if it only happens once every 100 years, I can build my house on a floodplain. Or still, when one person does it, others follow. Then the original risk is forgotten until the next big disaster happens. I wanted to tell you the story of Muhammad. In 2004, when the tsunami hit the Indian Ocean, over 200,000 people died, and millions more lost their homes and livelihoods. The world reached out to provide assistance. It took years to rebuild. I was sent by the United Nations to Aceh, Indonesia, to oversee recovery efforts on the west coast, at the epicenter of the disaster. The level of devastation was mind-blowing. After work, I'd go for a jog on the beach to relieve my stress. It was a dramatic coastline with huge waves and beaches that literally changed their configuration from month to month. So you could imagine my surprise when about a year after the tsunami, I saw a small housing development being built right at the edge of the beach. Post-tsunami, this seemed foolhardy. Had anyone put some thought into it, they would have designated the first kilometer inland from the coast as off-limits. Instead, there was this mad dash to replace lost infrastructure and the effort to restore people's lives back to normal. I saw something move in one of the houses, and I saw someone move in one of the buildings, and so struck up a conversation with them. Muhammad was a fisherman. He told me that the government had given him the house for free as part of a reconstruction effort. I asked him if he was nervous living so close to the ocean post-tsunami. He said he liked the sound of the waves and being close to his fishing boat. I suggested that if he lived a kilometer inland, he could easily access his boat and still hear the ocean. He replied, "Inshallah, I survived the tsunami, so why ignore this piece of good luck?" Fast forward 3 months later, a huge storm off the coast of Australia sent massive swell waves crashing into Aceh's coastline. The waves destroyed much of the newly constructed port area, local stores, and Muhammad's housing complex. I caught up with him a few days later. Luckily, his family had not moved in when the storm had hit. When I asked Muhammad if he was going to rebuild his house, He replied that he was moving his family far away from the ocean. I spent a long time reflecting on Mohammed's story and what I saw post-tsunami, and here are 4 personal takeaways. Disasters never repeat themselves. That's number 1. So preparing for the next disaster based upon your last experience is not always the best way to go. Mohammed's house did not get taken away by another tsunami, but by a storm. The location itself was vulnerable to a wide range of natural hazards. The simplest and least costly solution, avoidance, would have ensured that Mohammed and his family located inland, far away from these hazards. In fact, another tsunami did happen along the west coast of Sumatra years later, but it bypassed this location, again underscoring the point that disasters rarely repeat themselves, but understanding the nature of hazards and risks does pay dividends. Number 2, there is a short window of opportunity after a disaster where people are willing to change their behaviors. This is because everything that was normal has been destroyed, and the human mind can understand the need to adapt. But if you miss that window, people quickly go back to what they know. This is what happened to Mohammed and his family. Number 3, if there are no consequences to a disaster, there are no drivers to shift behavior. The tsunami destroyed almost everything in its path, but Mohammed's family survived and even got a free house out of it. In his mind, he escaped the worst of the disaster and might have even come out a little ahead. In fact, the world pitched in to help with money and aid to ensure the victims of this huge disaster received assistance. I want to get back to that word victim in a moment. Number 4, it took not 1, but 2 life-threatening events closely linked in time and space for Mohammed to change his behavior. It was only the second disaster that drove home the idea for him that the location he was living in was hazardous. Once that happened, no international aid was required to motivate Mohammed to make the right decision. Based on what I've said, I want to ask you to reflect on the following. When the second disaster hit Mohammed, did you feel the same level of compassion for him? Was he still a victim, or perhaps someone who needed to start taking risk management a little more seriously? Or let us play out another scenario. It's entirely possible, had enough time elapsed between the first and the second disaster, that Mohammed would not have considered moving away at all, but instead waited for his next free house and carried on. Let's reflect on this scenario from 2 different perspectives. For the risk taker, why does time matter when the consequences of making a bad decision are potentially just the same? Part of the answer lies in the fact that we tend to discount future risk in favor of immediate short-term gains. Another part of the answer is that the brain is wired to forget pain. This allows us to pick up the pieces and carry on, but it also potentially allows us to forget the consequences of poor risk-taking. Now let's look at the scenario as givers of aid and assistance. People are generous when they see victims of disaster. However, one is only considered a victim if the case can be made for ignorance and/or the unexpected. While I was working in Aceh, Indonesia, there was over 200 earthquakes reported the first year I was there. The entire archipelago is called the Ring of Fire since it sits on converging tectonic plates, making it one of the global hotspots for volcanoes, earthquakes, and tsunamis. It's hard to make the case for either ignorance or the unexpected in a location like this. In fact, there's a famous hill tribe in Indonesia that worships a volcanic god on the island of Java. Every 5 to 10 years, they have to be evacuated from their farms to escape the lava flows. The local disaster management authority is at its wit's end and wants to permanently relocate these villagers, but they stubbornly resist these efforts in favor of co-locating with their volcano god. Their status as victims is very much in question. I want to now use an example closer to home to illustrate my next 3 points. If you're thinking of moving to San Francisco, I encourage you to go to the California Earthquake Authority's website. According to their scientists, there's a 72% chance of a large earthquake occurring in San Francisco Bay Area in the next 30 years. That sounds a lot scarier than once in 100 years, doesn't it? The authority also notes that the earthquakes can cause liquefaction of soil and landslides, both of which can result in further damage to infrastructure. The website states that large earthquakes are likely to produce billions in damages and lead to tens of thousands of Bay residents becoming homeless. It doesn't speculate on loss of lives. This information underscores an important point. Large-scale disasters are complicated, with one event, in this case an earthquake, triggering others like landslides. Okay, now we know what the science says about the risk. Let's look at actual behaviors. San Francisco is one of the world's most costly housing markets. The San Andreas Fault runs right under Silicon Valley. You literally can't get earthquake risk insurance for any structure in these locations. Who in their right mind would want to live there knowing these risks? It turns out 7.7 million people do. Does that make them any less at risk? Probably not, but it does normalize this risk behavior, and that's important in the context of this conversation. People are very quick to justify risky behavior by pointing to others engaged in the same activity, but this doesn't make it any less risky. Let us return to the issue of language. Disaster literature and the popular press often adopts a phrase that applies to large-scale disasters like pandemics and earthquakes. It labels them as high-impact, low-probability events. But if you talk to any specialist, the probability of these disasters is quite high. What is in question is when they will happen. I would personally prefer to use the label high impact, high uncertainty, which to me comes closer to communicating the actual risk. San Francisco has made great strides towards trying to improve the safety of its buildings, but there remain significant issues around its skyscrapers, building codes, and older residential areas. But one can't just engineer your way out of a disaster. What happens if you're out of a building when a disaster strikes? Here lies one of the many complexities of disasters, and that's human nature. Japan has learned from experience that when an earthquake or tsunami warning goes off, a parent's first instinct is to go and rescue their children. This actually puts them directly in harm's way. The best response is for everyone to follow safety protocol during the disaster by going to the closest safe location and then reconnecting with loved ones post-disaster. This is not natural behavior and needs to be trained or drilled into a population, something that the Japanese now excel at. An example that may be more familiar to all of you are the airline's requirements to put on your oxygen mask when the cabin depressurizes before your child. How often have you drilled for that scenario? I, for one, have not. Scientists have made dire predictions about what the 21st century holds. Disasters like droughts, wildfires, and disease are on the rise. Do we dismiss these warnings because they seem too far-fetched? Or pray and hope they just don't happen to us? Can we pretend to be victims if we know that the risks are there and fail to take action to mitigate or avoid them? So far in my presentation, I've used examples that have been removed from most people's experience. This was done on purpose. It's far easier to think critically and rationally when a situation seems far removed from your own interests. But I'd now like to turn to British Columbia and the farms that have been devastated by the flood. I'm going to ask our tech assistant to roll the 2-minute video on Abbotsford, BC.
From above, when you see what the water's newly done to the Sumas Prairie in BC, you're really looking back in time. 100 years ago, that plain was a lake, and when the rains came, sometimes that lake stretched to 80 square kilometers, frustrating for farmers along its shorelines. So in the early 1920s, the lake was drained to create lucrative land that now sits below sea level. This is where most of the province's dairy and poultry now come from. The prospect of disaster always looming. Journalist Tyler Olson has been watching the water and the shifting climate for years.
Water flows downhill, and absent infrastructure like Barrowtown Pump Station, or absent the water making its way to the Fraser, it will go to what used to be Sumas Lake.
Add the decision to drain to a quirk of nature, and you have the core of the crisis. A name you hear spoken of with a lot of concern now, the Nooksack River. Curious, because look at the Nooksack. It doesn't travel anywhere near Canada. But when it floods, the water flows north, between those mountain ranges, right into that low, flat Sumas Prairie. The Barrowtown pumps, whose job it is to drain those waters, sit just to the north of it. That's why volunteers were frantically sandbagging those pumps overnight. The biggest in Western Canada, they have to be protected. The need for better protections long fought for and argued over.
Bringing the dikes up to standard is expected to cost more than $400 million, and that's in Abbotsford alone. And Abbotsford is the largest municipality in BC, but it's by far not the only one along the Fraser River. And so it requires a lot of international cooperation. It also requires cooperation between municipalities and counties. And it seems like that's where, in the last decade, even when we did know this threat exists, that work didn't get done.
In the absence of physical protections, all that's left to safeguard lives and livelihoods is a solid alert system. But in BC, it's a patchwork of systems. Different municipalities, different apps, different approaches. That wall of water was coming for BC, advancing as early as late last week, unstoppable. The land weakened by wildfires, unable to hold it back.
Thank you for that. I want to now open the floor to some discussion by asking 3 questions. Given what you know about Abbotsford and the floods in BC in general, what do you think the most appropriate responses moving forward for society in terms of not only supporting recovery efforts, but mitigating future risk? Secondly, what should impacted farmers do to manage those risks? And finally, is $400 million worth spending on building flood infrastructure in Abbotsford, or should we just use a portion of that money to relocate farmers and parts of the community most at risk? So I'll stop there. I'm hoping I can hear you guys because I'm on a different platform, but I would like to open it up to ideas and discussion. And maybe tech support, you can provide support by enabling people to unmute them and get them to answer questions or provide their thoughts and comments, because I can't see anybody. I see that Afton Medor has commented 400 million wouldn't come close to moving everyone, not even the loss of fertile, productive land. Agreed. I must admit I'm at a bit of a loss here, not being able to hear anybody or enable speaking. So if
Hi, Erik.
I
don't know if you can see me.
I can.
It just took
yes.
a little while to flip into a panelist mode for me, but
Thank you.
yeah, we can just welcome people to kind of type their comments or questions in the chat box, and I can help facilitate that discussion.
Yeah, thanks.
And I know you had kind of asked, like what, I think you posed really interesting questions. Should we use the money to build up flooding infrastructure? Should we use the money to, relocate the town or reroute the waterways, or, kind of how proactive or how reactive should we be? And I just love the example you gave of of Indonesia and the tsunami, and how you look at that as a scenario so far away, and you're like, oh my gosh, they built their house on where they had this tsunami. Are they crazy? But then using that to think, well, are there things that I do on a regular basis expecting a different outcome, or putting my farm or my family or my land at risk, without taking proactive measures to try and prevent or at least mitigate the negative outcomes of risk. And the session before this, we talked about BRM programming and specifically agrostability, and kind of the discussion was around, BRM and agrostability are one type of risk management solution, but certainly not the only thing. There's lots that you can do to gain a little bit of control and sense of control and confidence around managing risk when you kind of take that comprehensive approach. But back to Abbotsford, I don't want to derail the conversation. Just waiting to see if we have some questions come in. Here we go. So Afton says 40 million wouldn't come close to moving everyone, not to mention the loss of fertile, productive land. And then
yeah, and I would also add, just to that comment, if I may, that I agree. I think that number, I think, was developed as an estimate of how much money would cost to mitigate future risks through some flood berms. But there are other issues here. A lot of toxic waste has been also released in the floods, which means that soils and other things will also need to be cleaned up before those lands can be farmed again as well. So that price doesn't even cover the cost of getting back to normal in the same location either. So it is complicated. Sorry, Heather, over to you.
No, it's all good. Just jump in whenever you like. This is your time to shine. Afton goes on to say, we're going through flooding in some areas of Newfoundland and Labrador. The joys of living near water. It seems to happen every couple of years in various regions, but with increasing severity seeming to be normalized.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see that with wildfires. I was just listening to a CBC interview today about how folks in central BC just now as a regular basis are all packed up during fire season and ready to go at a moment's notice. Something that seems inconceivable in Ontario, but maybe is becoming the new normal in wildfire hazard areas. I would encourage people to make comments and thoughts here because there's no right or wrong answers, and I think Afton has done a great job of just here we go. Barry Remus. I compare the Sumas Flats in Red River Valley, where in 1979 the federal government provided building to build up dikes, build up the site 3 feet above the 1950 flood. This worked very well, but each dike slowed down the movement of water, creating a higher crest. Okay. Yep. And I guess the question is, you know, when you build those dikes, I mean, now what's happening is that people are forecasting bigger floods, so you can't really use past data to figure out how high those dikes are. You need potentially higher dikes. Blueberry farmer here in BC that has been affected by the flood. We need a much better warning system and a better response system. We are also facing huge heat waves this year. Changing weather events are going to become the norm and we have to adapt. Absolutely. Yeah. It's really, and you know, when one thinks about it, what is going to be the new norm? How do you manage your farm and your family and your lives? And I think at a certain point you have to assess what's an acceptable level of risk, because the best intended mitigation measures can always fail. Afton Mador, I think with the increasing frequency of disasters occurring nationally, we are becoming desensitized to risks. What was once a 1% risk of various risks is now closer to 10% or even higher. Agreed. I will let you, Heather, sometimes read some of these as well. Do you want to take the next one?
Sure. I mean, honestly, Eric, you're doing a fantastic job. So if you just want to run the show, I'm 100% behind you. But yeah, I can definitely help out. Sometimes it's tricky because the chat jumps up as you're trying to read something. So Duncan asks, are there other emergencies, disasters that you see the industry susceptible to that we aren't prepared for?
Well, disaster is my middle name, so yeah. I mean, I think there are diseases. There's risks of disease coming out that I do not think we're adequately prepared for. Crop or livestock disease, and some of those diseases have the potential to impact human populations as well. And we, you know, the current pandemic showed just how ill prepared we are for those kind of systemic shocks. And I think one of the things moving forward for me and my colleagues is we are trying to work with government and other agri-food supply chain groups to sort of say, how do you respond as an agri-food supply chain to a shock rather than just managing your own risks as a business? I think we have to balance both those kind of types of risk, because what we've seen is that there are knock-on effects. So even if it doesn't affect you directly, if it affects your supplier, it's going to affect you. So the price of ammonia has just gone through the roof. It's going to affect the price of fertilizers. That's going to affect you guys and how you raise your crops. You know, another knock-on effect for food this next year. So yeah, and I mean, I think just before I leave that one, and how do you prepare for something that's unforeseen? Okay, well, that's very much linked. I mean, I think when I think of Muhammad's story, he couldn't have possibly predicted that swell waves from a storm in Australia would have hit his house. That was unforeseen as a disaster. However, when you look at risk management, and this is something that Heather and her group do a great job at, is you look at vulnerabilities, right? And you look at vulnerabilities that expose you to a range of different hazards. And based on that exposure, you can take some measures that will mitigate a suite of hazards. And so you don't really have to worry about, 20 different types of disaster hitting you if you take, these particular steps with health inspection, and Heather can name a whole bunch of measures. I think you'll be much better prepared. And that, along with early warning systems that are better set up to sort of highlight where some of these risks are coming from, I think are really important. And Curtis, there is no video currently, so don't worry about that.
I was going to ask too, Eric, like we were just talking about, agri-stability, and I think, government, budgets and support programs are kind of based on an expectation that things are going to happen so often, but so you got a flood here and a drought here, but what if it becomes the new norm that every year there's a crazy flood, there's a crazy drought, and that's just the way it is? How do we respond, as industry, but also, as individuals as well? And I think talking about what's the likelihood, what's the frequency, I mean, doing that on a regular basis, because as frequencies might change or the impact might change, it kind of keeps you relevant and current with that. But what would happen to, government and say the BRM program? What choices do we have if it becomes instead of once in 100 years occurrence, it's a every year occurrence, which is likely, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got two choices, right? One is you do what they've done in New Orleans, which is to build a better set of mitigation measures that are now proofing you against a more severe type of disaster. Or if those mitigation measures prove to be too costly, the grim answer is that, life there in, for instance, New Orleans may not be tenable in the near future. And so you have to think about moving. And as preposterous as that sounds for people that have lived in a place all their life, history is replete with examples of civilizations and settlements that have had to close down because of drought that just never went away. And so, it becomes this calculation of how difficult, how expensive is it, and how, if there's a quick fix, hell, do it, take it, and you're going to be better off. But if it's going to increase a certain way, and, in the United States, when you look at 50% of the population living close to coastal areas that are going to be experiencing more storms, some of these towns are looking at really grim prospects for their future.
Well, and I think too, Eric, in our, even in my opening remarks yesterday, commenting on how our organization was born out of chaos. Like, it took the 1980s financial crisis to get, industry and government to kind of sit up and say, we need to help, farmers position themselves to better manage risk, to remain competitive and profitable no matter what's thrown at them. But I mean, the 80s were a long time ago. I know I was born in the early 80s. It was a long time ago. But, I can't help but think, maybe this is a little bit perverse, but in a way, COVID is kind of our chance to pay more attention to and really, have a recent event that has intimately affected, not just producers, but everyone worldwide. And, do you think maybe COVID is a trigger for getting industry to think a little bit more proactively or differently about how they manage risk, attitudes towards risk, and what they can do within their own realm of management and capacity.
Yeah, well, this sort of gets to the question that Maureen is asking here about how do you get people interested in conversations about risk management as well. And you know, SARS was supposed to be the wake-up call for pandemics. Not so much, right? COVID certainly should be a wake-up for pandemics, and just newsflash to any of you who understand what pandemics are, COVID is pandemic light. It is not nearly close to being what the Black Plague was or any of the really bad big ones, right? So I think those of us who can see the threat need to work with others to sort of have those discussions and really think about what it would mean to you and your farm and your operations if that disaster happened. It's not over there, it's here. There's something that's called Seeds of Change exercise that I like to do with people, where you kind of take an event and you look at primary, secondary, and third impacts around that event, and you begin to realize just how complex a disaster is. And that's one way to kind of open up people's thinking about the consequence of poor risk taking. And I also think that, you know, the media has a role to play, as do great groups like Farm Management Canada, you know, to raise awareness about this kind of stuff. Anonymous, on Monday, PEI potato industry took a real blow with no longer being able to export table or seed potatoes to the US. The decision was at the federal government level, not, wait a minute, not the industry. How do you prepare for that in the aftermath of the ripple effect? Yeah, that's, Heather might have an answer for that one. That goes beyond my ball house. Heather, do you? I know about this decision. I was just talking to Al about it yesterday.
Way to put me on the spot. Yeah, we should have Al Muscle and some of those folks on this.
He'll have an opinion.
I mean, I guess in the larger picture, it's back to, you know, not every risk is something that can be predicted or within your control. But, you know, I guess the benefits of doing, you know, an enterprise risk management exercise, which we talked about in the last session with MNP as well, is looking at, you know, what could possibly happen on the people side, on the market side, on the, you know, production and on the finance side, etc. What is, like you said, Eric, the, you know, likelihood or frequency, as well as the magnitude of that, and then how prepared are we? So looking at what we can do, what is within our control, and, you know, trying to do as much as you can to either, you know, avoid the risk or manage through that risk. And, you know, not everything is as simple as, oh, you just have a plan for it. But I think there's a lot more within our control in the way we respond to risk than we tend to think about. And I think, just picking up on what Maureen said as well, you know, she asks, what's the role of government in promoting better risk management? And I personally think that, you know, government has done a great job in terms of, you know, using BRM, business risk management, as, you know, as the language of choice. That's great for us because it has business in there, risk and management. But at the same time, I think sometimes it leads people to confuse the BRM programs with that's the only way to manage risk. And, you know, it's through insurance and it's through these reactive programs. Whereas I think, you know, if the government could get behind a more comprehensive education program around managing risk, and towards that enterprise risk that you talked about, I think we might be better off. I don't know if that specifically answers the question about PEI potatoes. However, yeah, maybe Eric, you have something to add there.
Yeah, just one other thing. You know, when I look at market risks, I think what's clear is that, you know, diversifying your market is really important. So during COVID, folks that were able to tap into local and regional markets that they may not have sold to in the past because they were part of bigger food chains did better. Canada has this tendency to rely a lot on US export markets, but there are lots of other countries in the world. And I think, if you do that and you also diversify your own production base, you'll find that you're more resilient. And I think that, resiliency is really the key to success here is when you're, rather than trying to manage risks, take the flip side of that and look at what are the opportunities to make your own business more robust by connecting it to, a broader range of suppliers and a broader range of potential markets. How are we doing on time here? I have a few closing thoughts that I can share with people, but I've also lost the comments. Oh, here we are.
I can help you out a little bit, Eric. Yeah, so we've got about 5 more minutes and then we'll be taking a lunch break. So Afton was commenting about, just how our approach to managing risks tends to be reactive rather than proactive. So, it again makes it difficult to say, I'm going to plan for every what if scenario. And then you might not feel like you know which way is up. But, there is a balance to strike. Often we talk about business planning and let's plan for your best, worst, and most likely case scenarios so that you have kind of a roadmap to go with, should the kind of switch be flipped to say like, oh, I think we're heading into worst case scenario. What did we say we were going to do again? And having that as a reference piece. And again, not everything can be predicted, but like thinking about it in advance before we're, up to our ears in it is probably a good thing.
Yeah, and I think, if you look, and I know this maybe, goes beyond the scope of what people themselves are probably capable of, but, you look at larger businesses and they constantly have their radar out for shifts in market, shifts in risks, and have strategies to respond to those risks. And that's something, that while it may not have the same level of resources, working with associations like Farm Management Canada, with the government and others, one can actually, start to benefit from the intelligence that comes through and then begin to ask yourself, how ready is my business? What steps can I take? And that way you're not just working alone on the issue, but you actually have some radar out there.
Wonderful. Well, and Eric, I do want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today and to share your worldly wisdom and experiences. I think it's just so interesting when we can think about, those guys over there and use that to kind of say, well, wait a second, are we doing the same thing here in a different context? So I think that's quite interesting. I will leave the final words to you in this session. We've got a couple minutes here, so I'll give you the final words of wisdom, and then we'll meet everyone back on the platform in an hour after we've had a bite to eat.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so all I was going to say is, a few takeaways for me. We need to start using better language to communicate risk. Just remind yourself constantly that using past historical data isn't going to help us manage future risks when things are shifting. Remember, large-scale disasters are complex, so that it's never one thing. You have to look at a sort of a plethora of hazards. I think it's important to stop framing risks just from your own personal perspective, but look at, the supply chain you're part of, and see what the knock-on effects are that you're vulnerable to. And then just finally remember that communities and businesses that invest in risk mitigation always fare better over time than those do not. Studies always show that investments in risk mitigation pay back between 4 and 6 times over. So that's really important. My closing paraphrase remarks is we tend to discount the future way too much, gambling the present gains against uncertain future impacts. And I think the future is closer than what we think. So it's time to start hedging our bets by investing in disaster mitigation now. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. I was just typing a comment to what you were saying, and I just said connecting risk management with economic impacts is a great idea, and I think we need to do more of that for sure. So thank you again so much. Thanks, everyone, for being here, for your great questions. Lots of positive comments in the chat there, Eric. So appreciate you very much. And yeah, we'll see everyone in about an hour.
Thank you.
Thanks.